Sign the papers and get out, Bradley. You're done here. Oliver sneered, throwing the contract. I smiled, signed it, and walked out. He thought he won. He didn't know that my exit just wiped out 70% of his firm's annual revenue. The corporate world is built on a very fragile illusion. People in expensive suits like to believe that contracts, brands, and fancy glass offices hold a business together. But if you strip away the marketing gloss and the corporate jargon, a business is nothing more than trust. And trust is personal. It doesn't belong to a logo. It belongs to the person who answers the phone at 2 in the morning when the entire supply chain is collapsing. For 15 years, I was that person at Sinclair Consulting. When I first walked through the doors of Sinclair Consulting back in 2011, the firm was barely surviving. I was 33 years old, hungry, and willing to work 80-hour weeks. The founder, Victor Sinclair, was a decent salesman but lacked the operational depth to scale. The company's annual recurring revenue was a mere $3 million, mostly coming from small local clients who paid late and complained constantly. Victor hired me as a managing director and offered me a simple deal: a base salary of $300,000, a 5% commission on any new accounts I brought in, and a promise of partnership if I could turn the firm around. I didn't just turn it around. I rebuilt it from the ground up. My strategy was simple: target the mid-market companies that were growing rapidly but were being ignored by the massive global consulting firms. I spent my first 3 years living out of hotels, flying from Chicago to Seattle, pitching, negotiating, and delivering results. By 2016, our annual recurring revenue had climbed to $15 million. I had brought in some of the most stable clients in the industry, but my crown jewel was Apex Retail. Apex Retail was a massive, fast-growing retail conglomerate. Their chief procurement officer, Lawrence Cole, was a notoriously tough negotiator who had fired 3 of our competitors for failing to deliver on their promises. I spent 6 months studying Apex's supply chain issues before I even pitched them. When I finally got a meeting with Lawrence, I didn't show him a flashy PowerPoint presentation. I showed him a 3-page document detailing exactly how we could save them $4 million in operational waste within 9 months. Lawrence liked my directness. We signed a trial contract. That trial turned into a multi-year partnership. Over the next decade, as Apex Retail grew, our contract grew with them. By 2021, the Apex account alone was worth $25 million annually. By 2026, that figure had climbed to $31.5 million. It was a massive, complex portfolio that required constant attention. I managed it personally. Lawrence Cole didn't call the Sinclair Consulting main line when he had a problem. He called my personal cell phone. We had dinners with our families, we played golf on weekends, and we trusted each other implicitly. Because of my success, my contract was updated in 2021. The firm's total annual recurring revenue had reached $45 million, which meant the Apex Retail contract accounted for exactly 70% of Sinclair Consulting's entire business. Knowing how dependent the company was on this single account, Victor Sinclair and the board offered me a key man retention package to ensure I wouldn't leave. The agreement was simple but lucrative. If I remained with the firm for 15 continuous years, I would receive a $2.5 million cash retention bonus and 10% equity in Sinclair Consulting. The vesting date was set for November 1, 2026. For a long time, Victor and I had a great working relationship. He knew I was the engine of the company, and he was content to let me run the operations while he acted as the public face of the firm. But things changed in 2021 when Victor's son, Oliver Sinclair, joined the company. Oliver was 34 years old and had a resume that looked impressive on paper, but was completely empty of actual substance. He had spent his 20s bouncing between low-level analyst roles at large firms, relying on his father's name to get through the door. He was arrogant, insecure, and obsessed with corporate hierarchy. Victor, who was now 66 and starting to think about retirement, wanted his son to take over the family legacy. In 2025, Oliver was promoted to executive vice president, bypassing several senior partners who had spent decades serving the company. From the day he was promoted, Oliver viewed me as a threat. He hated that the senior staff looked to me for guidance instead of him. He hated that the clients ignored his emails and called me directly. But most of all, he hated that on November 1, 2026, I was scheduled to receive 10% of the company's equity and a $2.5 million bonus. To Oliver, that money was his inheritance. Every dollar that went to me was a dollar less for the Sinclair family. By mid-2026, the tension in the office was palpable. Oliver started micromanaging my team, demanding daily status reports on the Apex account. He would schedule meetings with my staff while I was traveling, trying to find any mistake he could use against me. I ignored the petty provocations and focused on my work. The Apex contract was up for renewal in October, and I was deep in negotiations with Lawrence Cole to secure a 5-year extension. What Oliver didn't realize was that I had protected myself years ago. When the Apex contract was renegotiated in 2021, I insisted on inserting a specific clause into the agreement. It was Section 14A, a standard keyman provision. The clause stated that if I, Bradley Vance, ceased to be the active relationship manager and direct supervisor of the services, Apex Retail reserved the unilateral right to terminate the contract in its entirety upon 14 days written notice, with zero liability or exit penalty. Victor had signed off on the contract without thinking twice, assuming I would never leave. And Oliver, who rarely read contracts and spent most of his time looking at high-level financial dashboards, had no idea the clause even existed. As October approached, the final details of the Apex renewal were locked in. The new contract would guarantee Sinclair Consulting $31.5 million a year for the next 5 years. Oliver saw the numbers and decided it was time to make his move. He believed the account was secure, the contract was ready to be signed, and my presence was no longer necessary. In his mind, Sathayami now would save the firm $2.5 million and keep the 10% equity in his hands. He didn't know he was about to pull the pin on a grenade. The storm broke on a rainy Thursday morning, just 3 weeks before my vesting date. I had just arrived at the office and was preparing the final signing package for the Apex Retail renewal. The document was lying on my desk, bound in dark blue leather, waiting for Victor's signature. At 9:15, my desk phone rang. It was Victor's assistant. She sounded nervous. "Mr. Sinclair wants you in the executive boardroom immediately, and please bring your company laptop." I picked up my laptop, walked down the carpeted hallway to the corner office, and stepped inside. The atmosphere was freezing. Victor was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, looking down at his hands, refusing to make eye contact. Next to him stood Oliver, wearing a smirk that he was trying and failing to hide. On the table lay a thick manila folder and a printout of my cell phone logs. "Please sit down, Bradley," Victor said, his voice flat. I sat down, placing my laptop in front of me. "What is going on, Victor?" Oliver stepped forward, leaning his hands on the table. "We have a serious compliance issue, Bradley. A breach of corporate security that we cannot ignore." I looked at Oliver, then back at Victor. "A compliance issue?" "I have managed this firm's primary accounts for 15 years without a single operational error. What are you talking about?" Oliver opened the folder and slid a document toward me. It was a printout of several text messages and call logs from my personal mobile phone. According to Section 7.2 of the Sinclair Consulting IT Security Handbook, all client-facing communications regarding pricing, contract terms, and proprietary strategy must be conducted exclusively through company-approved channels and archived on our secure server. I looked at the logs. They showed calls and texts between me and Lawrence Cole. "We have been negotiating the Apex renewal, Oliver. Lawrence prefers to call my personal line. It's how we've done business for a decade. Every major decision is immediately documented in follow-up emails sent from my corporate account. There is no breach here. You discuss pricing models and commission percentages on an unsecured personal device," Oliver sneered, his voice rising. "That is a direct violation of your employment agreement. It's a material breach. We have proprietary financial data sitting on your personal phone, completely outside of our control." I looked at Victor. "Victor, you know how Lawrence works. He doesn't like red tape. If I had refused to take his calls on my cell, we would have lost this account to our competitors 5 years ago. You signed off on this strategy." Victor cleared his throat but didn't look up. "Times change, Bradley. We are preparing for a transition and we have to tighten up our compliance." "Oliver is right. The policy is clear. This is a setup," I said, my voice remaining quiet and steady. "You want to fire me before November 1st. Oliver laughed, a sharp, arrogant sound. "Don't flatter yourself, Bradley. This is about protecting the firm. Because of this material breach, we are terminating your employment for cause, effective immediately, and since it is for cause, your keyman retention package is voided. No bonus, no equity, no commission on the pending Apex renewal." He slid a termination letter across the table. It was already signed by Victor. I read through the document. It was a standard separation agreement, but the clause regarding the forfeiture of my $2.5 million bonus and the 10% equity was highlighted in bold. The document also stated that I was required to immediately return all company property and that my 12-month non-compete clause remained in full effect. Oliver was watching me closely, expecting me to shout, to plead, or to threaten to sue. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to feel the power of throwing a senior partner out of the building, but I didn't give him the satisfaction. I knew the law and I knew the contracts. A fabricated compliance violation based on a policy that had never been enforced in the firm's history would never stand up in a court of arbitration. My attorney would tear their argument to shreds within 30 days. But more importantly, I knew that suing them wasn't even my best option. The real leverage was already in motion. I looked at Victor one last time. Are you sure this is what you want, Victor? After 15 years of building this company together, Victor shifted in his chair, looking uncomfortable. We have to follow the policy, Bradley. I'm sorry, I nodded. Understood. I took out my pen, signed the termination letter, and slid it back to Oliver. His eyes widened slightly, surprised by how easily I had surrendered. I opened my laptop, logged out of my corporate email, and closed the lid. I stood up, took my personal cell phone from my pocket, and placed my company access card on the table. I will need 10 minutes to pack my personal belongings, I said. Oliver smirked, crossing his arms. Security will escort you to your desk. We've already deactivated your network access. Don't try to download any client files. They belong to Sinclair Consulting. They belong to whoever the clients trust, Oliver, I replied quietly. 10 minutes later, I walked out of the building carrying a small cardboard box containing a few framed family photos and my personal notebook. The rain was pouring down on the streets of Chicago, but as I got into my car, I felt a strange sense of relief. I parked my car a block away from the office, pulled out my personal phone, and dialed Lawrence Cole's direct number. Hey, Bradley, Lawrence answered on the second ring. I just got the draft contract from your team. We're ready to sign this afternoon. Don't sign it, Lawrence, I said. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. What do you mean? What's going on? I was just terminated from Sinclair Consulting, I said calmly. They fired me this morning. What? Lawrence's voice went cold. Fired you? For what? They claimed I violated IT policy by talking to you on my personal phone, I explained. But the truth is, my 15-year retention bonus and equity were vesting in 3 weeks. They wanted to avoid paying. Lawrence let out a low growl. Those idiots. They think they can pull a stunt like that and still keep our business? I've been working with you for 15 years, Bradley. Not Sinclair Consulting. I appreciate that, Lawrence. I'm going to take a few days off to get my affairs in order. But you need to look at Section 14C of your current agreement. I know exactly what it says, Lawrence replied, his voice shifting from anger to a cold, calculated business tone. I'll have my legal team handle it today. Enjoy your weekend, Bradley. I'll call you on Monday. I hung up, started the engine, and drove home. The trap was set, and Oliver Sinclair had walked right into it. The morning after my termination, I met with my attorney, George Miller, in his office overlooking Millennium Park. George was a senior employment partner at a respected Chicago firm, and he had been reviewing my executive contracts for over a decade. I laid out the termination letter, the company policies, and the cell phone logs on his desk. George read through the termination letter, a slow smile spreading across his face. Fired for cause because you took client calls on your personal phone? After 15 years of them paying you commissions based on those exact phone calls? That's their argument, I said. Oliver claims it's a material breach of Section 7.2 of the IT handbook. George laughed, shaking his head. In the state of Illinois, and under standard federal labor principles, a company cannot suddenly enforce a dormant policy in order to strip an employee of vested compensation. That is the definition of bad faith termination. We will file a formal demand for arbitration with the American Arbitration Association by Monday morning. We're going to demand the full $2.5 million retention bonus, the immediate vesting of your 10% equity, and the payment of all outstanding commissions. What about the non-compete? I asked. George flipped to Section 9 of my employment agreement. It's right here, Bradley. The non-compete clause only remains active if you are terminated for legitimate cause or if you resign voluntarily. If they terminate you without cause, which is what a sham compliance firing legally amounts to, the non-compete is null and void. The moment we file arbitration, you are free to work for whoever you want, including starting your own firm. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. But the legal battle over my bonus was just the sideshow. The main event was happening in the procurement office of Apex Retail. On Monday morning, Lawrence Cole met with his legal department and the executive board of Apex Retail. They didn't need to debate the issue for long. Apex was a multi-billion-dollar operation, and they relied on Sinclair Consulting to manage their supply chain optimization, inventory forecasting, and logistics vendor relations. The transition to a new software system was midway through, and a single mistake could cost Apex millions in delayed shipments. Lawrence knew that Oliver Sinclair had never managed a live supply chain in his life. He also knew that the senior analysts on my team at Sinclair Consulting were loyal to me, not to the Sinclair name. At 10:30 a.m., a secure electronic document and a certified courier letter were delivered to the executive offices of Sinclair Consulting. The document was signed by Lawrence Cole and Apex Retail's general counsel. The letter was brief, cold, and devastating. It referenced Section 14C of the Master Services Agreement between Sinclair Consulting and Apex Retail. The clause was explicit. In the event that Bradley Vance is removed from his role as active relationship manager and direct supervisor of the services, or is otherwise no longer employed by Sinclair Consulting, Apex Retail reserves the right to terminate this agreement and all outstanding statements of work, in whole or in part, upon 14 days written notice, without further liability, termination fees, or penalty. The notice stated that because Bradley Vance had been terminated by Sinclair Consulting on October 15, 2026, Apex Retail was officially exercising its unilateral right to terminate the contract. The agreement would officially end on October 29, 2026. Furthermore, Apex Retail demanded the immediate return of all proprietary data and instructed Sinclair Consulting to cease all work on the upcoming supply chain migration. They also stated that the pending $31.5 million renewal contract, which was sitting on Victor Sinclair's desk, was officially withdrawn. At the same time, Lawrence Cole sent an internal memo to his procurement team, instructing them to freeze all pending invoices from Sinclair Consulting. They would pay only for services rendered up to the date of termination, but not $1 more. While this was happening, I was sitting in a quiet coffee shop, enjoying my first morning without corporate emails. I knew exactly what was unfolding in the Sinclair offices. When a consulting firm loses 70% of its revenue overnight, it doesn't just lose money, it loses its line of credit. Sinclair Consulting had a $10 million revolving line of credit with a regional commercial bank, which they used to fund payroll and operational expenses during slow quarters. The bank required the firm to maintain a minimum debt-to-service ratio and a minimum revenue threshold. That credit line was backed by the Apex Retail contract. With the Apex contract terminated, the bank would immediately trigger a material adverse change clause, freeze the credit line, and demand immediate repayment of any outstanding balance. Moreover, Sinclair Consulting had a staff of 80 analysts, consultants, and administrative support. The monthly payroll was nearly $600,000. Without the Apex revenue and with the bank line of credit frozen, the firm's cash runway was less than 30 days. I took a sip of my coffee and checked my phone. I had already received 3 text messages from former colleagues at the office. They said that Oliver had just walked into the billing department with a pale face, demanding to see the historical contract files for Apex Retail. Apparently, Oliver had finally read Section 14 set. For 15 years, Victor and Oliver had treated Sinclair Consulting like a personal ATM, pulling out millions to fund their lavish lifestyles, expensive cars, and suburban estates. They believed they owned the business, and they believed they owned the clients. They had forgotten that in the professional services industry, the only asset that matters is the people who do the work. I closed my laptop and walked out into the crisp autumn air. The countdown had begun, and Sinclair Consulting had exactly 14 days to realize the magnitude of their mistake. By Thursday morning, the office of Sinclair Consulting was in a state of absolute panic. The formal termination letter from Apex Retail had gone through the executive committee, and the news had leaked to the rest of the staff. The senior partners, who had been kept in the dark about my firing, were furious. They had called an emergency meeting in the main boardroom, demanding answers from Victor and Oliver. One of the partners, a veteran named Thomas Vance, no relation to me, just a common name, later told me that the meeting was a bloodbath. Thomas had looked at Oliver and asked point-blank, "You fired the man who holds 70% of our revenue over a cell phone policy that we all violate every single day?" "It was a security issue," Oliver had shouted, his voice cracking with anxiety. "He was sharing company secrets on an unsecured line. He was talking to the client who pays our salaries." Thomas had roared back, "You didn't fire him for security, Oliver. You fired him because you wanted to steal his equity and avoid paying his retention bonus. And now you've ruined the company." The financial reality was setting in fast. The bank had indeed frozen Sinclair Consulting's line of credit. With the Apex account gone and the credit line suspended, the firm was facing a cash flow deficit of $400,000 for the upcoming month. They couldn't even make payroll for the 80 consultants and analysts who kept the firm running. If payroll failed, the staff would walk out, and Sinclair Consulting would face immediate liquidation. Oliver spent 3 days trying to reach Lawrence Cole. He left 19 messages with Lawrence's assistant, sent dozens of urgent emails, and even drove to the Apex corporate headquarters in Rosemont, Illinois, attempting to get a face-to-face meeting. Lawrence's assistant gave him the same cold response every time. "All communications regarding this contract must go through our legal department." When Oliver finally realized that Lawrence wouldn't speak to him, he turned his focus to me. My phone started ringing on Wednesday afternoon. I watched Oliver's name flash on the screen, let it ring, and placed it back on the desk. He called 5 times that day. He sent 3 emails, each one shifting in tone from professional demands to desperate appeals. Finally, on Thursday afternoon, I answered. "Bradley, thank God." Oliver's voice was breathless, stripped of all the arrogance he had displayed a week earlier. "We need to talk. We need to get together and to resolve this misunderstanding." I don't think there's any misunderstanding, Oliver, I said calmly. I was terminated for cause. My network access was cut, and I was escorted out of the building by security. Listen, Bradley, we made a quick decision based on a strict interpretation of the handbook, Oliver stammered. But we can work this out. Victor and I want to offer you your position back. We can reinstate your contract, and we can discuss a path to vesting your bonus. I'm busy today, Oliver. Please, Bradley, just give me 15 minutes. Name the place. I paused, letting the silence stretch for a few seconds. Meet me at the Union League Club at 4 p.m. The Union League Club was a historic, private business club in downtown Chicago where I had been a member for 10 years. It was a formal environment where shouting or making a scene was strictly forbidden. I chose it specifically to keep Oliver on his best behavior. When I arrived at 4, Oliver was already waiting in the lounge, looking disheveled. His tie was slightly crooked, and he had dark circles under his eyes. He stood up quickly when he saw me, reaching out a hand. I ignored the hand and sat down in the leather armchair opposite him. "What do you want to discuss, Oliver?" I asked. Oliver sat down, leaning forward. "We want to cancel the termination, Bradley. We'll draft a reinstatement agreement. We'll even pay you the $2.5 million bonus on November 1st as scheduled. All we need is for you to call Lawrence Cole, tell him it was an internal misunderstanding, and get Apex to sign the 5-year renewal." I looked at Oliver. The desperation in his eyes was pathetic. He had believed that the company's size and his family's ownership gave him absolute power. He had never understood that the clients didn't care about the Sinclair brand. They cared about the people who delivered the work. "The bridge is burned, Oliver," I said quietly. "What do you mean?" Oliver's voice rose slightly and he quickly lowered it, remembering where we were. "We're offering you everything you wanted. The bonus, the equity, your job. You're offering me what I've already earned," I said. "But you're offering it from a sinking ship. Sinclair Consulting doesn't have the cash to make payroll next month. The bank has frozen your credit line. Even if I came back, the firm is dead. We can recover," Oliver pleaded. "If we get the Apex renewal signed, the bank will restore the credit line immediately." "Apex is not coming back, Oliver." "Why not? They've worked with us for 15 years. "They worked with me for 15 years, I corrected him. "And as of yesterday, Apex Retail has officially signed a new master services agreement with Vance Advisory." Oliver went entirely pale. "Vance Advisory? What is that?" "It's my new firm," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I registered the corporation on Monday morning. Because you fired me without cause, my non-compete is void. Lawrence Cole and the board of Apex Retail have already agreed to transition their entire $31.5 million portfolio to my firm effective October 30th. "You can't do that," Oliver whispered, his hands trembling. "That's client theft. We'll sue you." "On what grounds?" I asked. "You terminated me. You voided the non-compete. And Apex Retail triggered a standard keyman clause that you and Victor signed off on in 2021. Everything is completely legal. My attorney, George Miller, has already filed the arbitration demand for my $2.5 million bonus and my 10% equity. And we're going to win because your compliance charge is a joke." "But you can't run the Apex account alone," Oliver stammered, grasping at straws. "You don't have the analysts. You don't have the delivery team." I smiled. That was the final piece of the puzzle. "I don't need to run it alone," I said. "This morning, 12 of the senior analysts and consultants who manage the Apex account at Sinclair Consulting handed in their 2-week resignations. They're joining Vance Advisory on November 1st. I'm giving them a 20% salary increase, funded by the 5% commission I no longer have to share with you and Victor." Oliver stared at me, his mouth open, unable to speak. He looked like a man who had just watched his house burn down while realizing he was the one who had dropped the match. "You've ruined us," Oliver whispered. "No, Oliver," I said as I stood up. "You ruined yourselves the moment you decided that greed was more important than trust." I walked out of the club, leaving Oliver sitting alone in the quiet lounge. The game was over and the cleanup was about to begin. The transition of the Apex Retail account to Vance Advisory was executed with surgical precision. On October 30th, the 14-day termination period officially ended. The next morning, Vance Advisory went live. We had leased a modern, open-concept office space in the West Loop of Chicago. It was smaller and less ostentatious than the glass tower Sinclair Consulting occupied, but it had everything we needed: fast internet, secure servers, and a dedicated team of professionals. The 12 senior analysts and consultants who had resigned from Sinclair joined me on day 1. They knew the Apex systems inside and out. Because we had planned the migration carefully, Apex Retail didn't experience a single hour of downtime. The supply chain optimization software continued to run, inventory forecasts were delivered on schedule, and logistics vendors were paid without delay. Lawrence Cole was thrilled. In a formal email to his board, he noted that the transition had been entirely seamless, proving that the value of the partnership lay in the team, not the corporate entity they had left behind. For Sinclair Consulting, however, the departure of Apex Retail was a fatal blow. With 70% of their revenue gone, the firm's financial structure collapsed like a house of cards. The bank refused to negotiate. They officially declared a default on the $10 million line of credit, froze all of the firm's cash reserves, and demanded immediate repayment. Without access to cash, Victor and Oliver couldn't meet the November payroll for the remaining staff. The news spread quickly through the office, and by the first week of November, more than half of the remaining consultants had walked out. The partners who had stayed realized their equity was worthless. They banded together, hired a restructuring attorney, and forced Victor Sinclair to step down as CEO. The board of directors, desperate to salvage any value, terminated Oliver Sinclair without severance. Oliver's reputation in the Chicago consulting market was completely ruined. In the professional services industry, word travels fast. Everyone knew that he had destroyed a $45 million firm in less than 2 weeks because of a greedy attempt to steal a senior partner's bonus. He became toxic. No reputable advisory firm would even grant him an interview. The last I heard, he had relocated to a minor real estate firm in another state, working a low-level sales job far away from the corporate boardroom. To avoid complete bankruptcy, the remaining partners sold the assets of Sinclair Consulting to a mid-sized competitor for pennies on the dollar. The brand name was retired, and the glass offices were cleared out. Victor Sinclair was forced to liquidate several of his personal real estate holdings, including his suburban estate, to pay off the bank loans he had personally guaranteed. He retired in obscurity, his legacy destroyed by the very son he had tried to elevate. Meanwhile, our arbitration case against the remains of Sinclair Consulting and their insurance carrier proceeded quickly. My attorney, George Miller, presented a mountain of evidence showing that the IT policy violation was a bad faith fabrication. We showed that Victor and Oliver had never enforced the personal phone policy for any other employee, and that they had actively encouraged me to use my personal line for client relations for 15 years. We also presented emails from Oliver to the billing department, sent just days before my firing, asking how much money the firm would save if my retention bonus was voided. Faced with clear evidence of bad faith and malicious intent, the insurance company representing Sinclair Consulting's board advised them to settle. On December 15th, we signed a settlement agreement. I received my full $2.5 million retention bonus, plus an additional $500,000 to cover my attorney fees and outstanding commission payments. The money was wired directly into Vance Advisory's operating account, giving us a massive cash reserve to fund our future growth. Today, Vance Advisory is thriving. We finished our first year with $32 million in revenue, and we've already expanded our client list to include 3 other major logistics firms. We operate with a lean, highly paid staff. Because we don't have to support the lavish lifestyles of nepotistic founders or pay for bloated corporate marketing campaigns, our profit margins are nearly double what they were at Sinclair. Every morning, I walk into our West Loop office and look out at the Chicago skyline. I see tall glass towers where young executives are still playing their corporate games, convinced that their titles and family names make them invulnerable. I smile, take a sip of my coffee, and get to work. I've learned that the corporate ladder is made of wood, and it's very easy to burn down. But the relationships you build, the trust you earn, and the promises you keep, those are the only things that last.